The dusty sun of the frontier beat down upon the wooden beams of the small town square, the kind of place where whispers turned into rumors and jokes turned into cruelty. A 19-year-old African labor girl named Abeni had been working tirelessly in the fields outside town, her hands hardened by soil, and her spirit carrying both exhaustion and unbroken dignity. She was young, strong, and determined, but to many in that cruel settlement, she was treated as nothing more than a novelty, an outsider, someone to be laughed at, someone to be mocked for the color of her skin and the fire in her eyes. That day, the men of the town had gathered for what they called an auction, a cruel spectacle staged more for entertainment than trade. They pushed Abeni forward, not because she was for sale, but because some cruel drunkards thought it would be amusing to see her stand on a block as though her life and freedom were a joke. Her heart pounded with humiliation as the jeers and laughter echoed around her. She clenched her fists, holding back tears, her chin raised high, refusing to let them see her break. Then, through the haze of heat and laughter, a tall rancher stood at the edge of the crowd. His name was Samuel Carter, a man in his mid-30s with weathered hands, a stern jawline, and eyes that had seen more than most. He was not a man easily swayed by crowds, nor one who took lightly to mockery. When the so-called bidding began, and the men shouted ridiculous numbers as if mocking the worth of her humanity, Samuel stepped forward. His voice was deep, carrying authority that cut through the laughter. "I'll take her." The square fell silent. The joke had ended, though no one yet realized how. Samuel tossed a sum of money onto the table, not with glee, but with quiet defiance, daring anyone to challenge him. None did. The girl was handed over to him as though she were an object, though his gaze told her something different. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Abeni sat in the wagon, her heart heavy, wondering if she had simply been passed from one cruel hand to another. She stared at the land rolling by, endless stretches of dry plains and scattered cattle, wondering what fate awaited her. Samuel, for his part, kept glancing toward her, reading the fire in her eyes, the mistrust, the fear. He didn't speak until the wagon reached his homestead. "You're safe here," he said simply, climbing down and offering his hand. She did not take it, instead stepping down on her own. He nodded, respecting the gesture. The days that followed were strange to Abeni. She expected chains, harsh words and commands, but instead she was given freedom to walk, food to eat and shelter from the sun. Samuel treated her not as property, but as someone whose spirit he quietly admired. He gave her work, yes, but not in cruelty. Instead, he invited her to help with the horses, to manage the cattle, to mend what was broken around the ranch. At first she resisted, waiting for the mask to fall, waiting for his true nature to reveal itself. But it never did. Day by day she watched him move with quiet strength, a man who spoke little, but whose actions carried weight. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, she sat on the porch, her thoughts heavy with the memory of the auction. Samuel walked over, leaning on the railing, his hat tilted low. "They thought it was a joke," he said, his voice even. "But I don't take people for jokes." She turned to look at him, unsure how to respond. His eyes held no mockery, only a strange respect that unnerved her. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe a little easier. Yet beneath that fragile trust lay something stronger, something unspoken. The town still whispered, calling her names, mocking Samuel for marrying a joke, even though no vows had yet been spoken. And still Samuel never bent to their words. He kept her close, not with force, but with protection. For the first time since she had been mocked on that stage, Abeni began to sense that this man, this rancher, might not have saved her out of pity, but out of something deeper, something that neither of them dared to name yet. And so began the story of a girl who had been humiliated before a crowd, only to find, in the quiet strength of a rancher's home, the first flicker of dignity, safety, and perhaps against all odds, love. The whispers in town grew louder with every passing week. What had begun as a cruel joke at the auction was now turning into a scandal. People scoffed when Samuel brought Abeni with him to the general store, their stares sharp as knives, their words muttered loud enough to sting. Some mocked openly, asking if he'd lost his mind. Others spat at the ground in disgust, unwilling to accept the sight of a proud rancher walking side by side with a 19-year-old African girl. Abeni felt the weight of those eyes every time, the sting of prejudice pressing on her chest like a stone. But Samuel never wavered. He walked tall, his hand steady on the reins, his voice calm when addressing her, never giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing him falter. For Abeni, that defiance began to mean something more than kindness. It became a shield, and slowly she found herself standing taller at his side. At the ranch, life unfolded in rhythms she had never known. She learned how to guide cattle across the plains, how to mend saddles, how to ride with strength and control. Samuel taught her with patience, never raising his voice, always giving her the choice to learn or walk away. At first she tested him, pushing back with silence, sometimes even with fire in her words, but he never broke. He let her anger spill, never once treating her with cruelty. And in that patience Abeni began to soften, not in weakness but in trust. She started humming as she worked, her laughter rare and fragile at first, slipping out when the horses nuzzled her hands or when Samuel tried, with quiet awkwardness, to tell a joke. For the first time since she could remember, the weight of her past humiliation began to lift, replaced with a fragile hope that life could be more than survival. But peace in a place like that was never meant to last. One evening, as the horizon burned with the last light of day, a group of townsmen rode up to the ranch. They carried bottles and hatred in equal measure, their faces twisted with the kind of cruelty that festers in weak hearts. Abeni watched from the porch as Samuel stepped out to meet them. They spat insults, calling her names, mocking him for living with a girl bought like livestock. One man, drunk and bitter, demanded he send her away, saying she had no place among decent folk. Abeni's chest burned with shame, the old humiliation rising again, but before she could retreat, Samuel's voice cut through the night. "She's not leaving," he said, his hand resting calmly on the handle of his revolver, not in threat but in warning. "She's my wife." The words silenced the men for a moment, then erupted into curses and disbelief. Abeni's breath caught in her throat. Wife. The word was heavy, terrifying, and yet liberating. For the first time, Samuel had spoken aloud what had been unspoken between them. The men left that night with threats and bitter words, but Abeni knew life would only grow harder from then on. Yet as she turned to him, her eyes wide with confusion and fear, Samuel only met her gaze steadily. "They'll keep coming," he said softly. "But they won't break us, not unless you want to leave." His words gave her a choice, not a command. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. She realized she no longer wanted to run. The days that followed were filled with tension. The town's hostility grew, some merchants refusing to serve them, others whispering curses under their breath. Yet in the quiet of the ranch, something new bloomed. Abeni found herself waking before dawn, walking with Samuel across the fields, sharing meals in silence that grew into conversation, and conversations that grew into laughter. The ranch that had once felt like a cage now became a sanctuary. Slowly, the walls she had built around her heart began to crumble, not because Samuel demanded it, but because he had earned it with his quiet strength. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat together under the stars, the air cool and still. Abeni spoke of her past for the first time, the hardships she had endured, the loneliness, the shame of being mocked in that square. Her voice shook, but Samuel listened without interruption, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if holding her story in reverence. When she finished, he turned to her and said simply, "You were never a joke. You were always more than they could see." The words struck her like a flame. In the darkness, igniting something she had thought long dead, belief in herself. But the town would not let go so easily. One night, flames lit the edge of the ranch. Someone had set fire to the barn. Albany and Samuel fought together to save the animals, their hands blistered, lungs burning with smoke. In the chaos, Albany proved her strength, pulling frightened horses to safety, refusing to give up even as the heat seared her skin. When the fire was finally beaten back, they stood side by side, blackened with soot, breathing hard but victorious. It was in that crucible of fire that their bond solidified, no longer fragile, but forged in resilience. The next morning, Samuel stood in the town square with Albany at his side. He faced the same men who had mocked her at the auction, the same voices that had jeered and laughed. "You tried to shame her," he said, his voice strong, "but she has more courage than any of you. She's my wife, and she's earned her place, here with more strength than your hatred will ever carry." The square fell silent. Some looked away in shame, others in anger, but none dared challenge him. And in that silence, Albany stood taller than she ever had before, not as a girl mocked at auction, but as a woman who had found her dignity, her strength and her place. As seasons passed, the ranch thrived, not because life grew easier, but because they faced it together. Albany became not only Samuel's partner but his equal, her laughter echoing through the fields, her hands shaping the land alongside his. What had begun as humiliation had transformed into triumph, and what the town had meant as a joke had become a story of love, resilience and courage. And though whispers would never fully vanish, Albany no longer cared, for she had written her own ending, and in it she was never again a joke, but a woman of strength, dignity, and unbreakable spirit.